All right, let's dive right into this explainer. Today, we're going to discover how translating ancient texts is actually this incredibly fascinating high-stakes detective game. You might think translation is just grabbing a dictionary and swapping out a word in one language for a word in another. But when we're looking at ancient texts, like the Bible, it is so much more than that. It's really an exercise in time travel. Understanding the ancient culture is literally the only way to actually understand what is being said.
So here's our roadmap for today. We'll start with number 1, more than just words, move into the love and hate binary, explore the leave-or-rape marriage puzzle, decode the kinsman-redeemer, and wrap up with context dictates the meaning. Let's get started.
Section 1. More than just words. Understanding the cultural gap.
Okay, so the absolutely crucial point we need to establish right up front is that language gaps are, at their core, worldview gaps. Because of that, translation isn't just swapping words, it's a two-step process. Step 1 is breaking down the actual meaning using that original cultural context. And then step 2 is figuring out how to communicate that meaning in the target language. You've got to understand the worldview and the specific concepts of the original speaker before you can even begin to find the right words in a totally new language. If you skip step 1, well, things get really confusing really fast.
Section 2. The love and hate binary. A translation case study.
Let's look at a prime example of this from Genesis chapter 29. Jacob goes north, he meets his uncle Laban, and works to earn the right to marry Rachel. But Uncle Laban pulls a total fast one and tricks him in the night, so Jacob actually ends up marrying Leah instead, before eventually getting to marry Rachel as well. Now, in English, the text says God opened Leah's womb because she was unloved compared to Rachel. But translators hit a massive wall when trying to put this into other languages. For example, when translating this into the Orma language, the local translator had to use the word hated. Leah was hated. To our modern ears, that sounds incredibly harsh, doesn't it? But when we dig a little deeper, we find a huge cultural and linguistic difference. And this brilliantly illustrates the whole problem. In English, we have this massive spectrum of affection. We can love our spouse, we can like our coworker, dislike a rival sports team, and hate a certain food. We have endless gradations. But languages like Orma, Swahili, and Biblical Hebrew, they completely lack our modern gradations of affection. They offer only a stark binary, love or hate. They literally don't have a built-in distinction between liking and loving or disliking and hating.
Seeing this cultural mindset gives us a much clearer picture of what the text means when God says, I loved Jacob but hated Esau. So when a literal translation reads hated, it's not actual hatred. I mean, we know God blessed Esau heavily with many descendants. Rather, it's an ancient idiom for a comparison of affection. It just means Jacob was chosen or preferred over Esau, but it's restricted by the language limitations of that strict love-hate binary. Section 3. The leave-or-rape marriage puzzle, solving an ancient mystery. Now, let's switch gears and look at the Book of Ruth. A famine has driven Naomi's Israelite family to Moab. Her husband and sons die, leaving her completely destitute with her widowed daughters-in-law, Ruth and Orpah. As she decides to pack up and return home, Naomi turns to them and issues this completely baffling set of instructions. She desperately urges them to turn back to their own mother's homes in Moab rather than follow her back to Bethlehem.
She actually says to them, "Have I yet sons in my womb that they may be your husbands? If I should even get a husband tonight and bear sons, would you wait until they are grown?" She is genuinely suggesting they can't wait 30 years for her to have new babies that will grow up to marry them. I mean, what in the heck is she talking about? To modern ears, waiting around to marry your mother-in-law's unborn infant sounds absolutely absurd, right? It makes zero sense in our culture to tie your romantic future to the hypothetical future babies of your mother-in-law. So, what exactly is driving this bizarre logic? Well, here is the key that unlocks the puzzle. It's the ancient cultural custom of leave-or-rape marriage, which is laid out in Deuteronomy 25. This was specifically designed to provide for widows in a society where women couldn't just go out and get a job to support themselves. So, if a husband died childless, his brother was required to marry the widow. The firstborn son of that new union would then take the deceased brother's name and inherit his property. It kept the family line intact and ensured the widow's security. We actually see the main precedent for this in Genesis 38 with Judah and Tamar. Tamar's first husband dies. The second brother marries her, but he refuses to provide an heir to inherit his brother's property, so he dies. The third brother is too young. Now, the absolute crucial takeaway here is that Judah, the clan patriarch, held the legal responsibility to provide a husband from within the family structure. So bouncing back to Ruth, Naomi is basically saying, listen, I am the clan elder now, and I have absolutely no more sons to fulfill this legal clan duty for you, which makes her despair completely logical within her specific culture.
Section 4. Decoding the kinsman redeemer, Boaz and the Goel.
This whole concept flows right into chapter 2. Ruth goes to glean grain in a field owned by a wealthy relative named Boaz. Naomi is thrilled about this, pointing out that Boaz is a Goel. Now, some English versions translate this simply as close relative, but the word redeemer carries massive legal and financial weight in ancient Israelite culture. It's a very active role, not just a label on a family tree.
According to Leviticus 25, a Goel was the ultimate ancient safety net. If a relative fell into extreme poverty, the Goel was expected to step up. Their duties included buying back family land that had been sold off, paying debts to keep relatives out of debtor's prison, or even rescuing a family member who had sold themselves into literal slavery. It's entirely about moving someone out of a terrible situation and restoring them to a good one.
So naturally, Ruth asked Boaz to be her Goel, but Boaz plays it totally by the book. He convenes a city council at the gates because, as it turns out, there's actually an unnamed closer relative. In modern legal terms, this closer relative holds the right of first refusal to buy Naomi's land and redeem the family. Boaz legally has to offer it to him first.
At first, this unnamed relative readily agrees to buy the land. I mean, it's a great real estate deal. But then Boaz carefully drops a stipulation. On the day you buy the field, you must also acquire Ruth to raise up a son for her dead husband, marrying the Goel custom with the Liverate marriage custom. And immediately, the man suddenly backs out, saying, I cannot redeem it for myself because I would jeopardize my inheritance.
So, what does he actually mean by jeopardizing his inheritance? Well, the cryptic phrase, my inheritance, actually refers to his future son's estate. Just look at the math here. If he marries Ruth, the land he buys doesn't belong to him. It belongs to the baby Ruth has. Furthermore, if he has more children with Ruth, he's actively diluting his own existing property among a much larger pool of sons. He realizes having a child with Ruth will drastically shrink the slice of the pie his existing sons will receive. So, he passes the right over to Boaz.
Section 5. Context dictates the meaning, the nuances of Hesed.
Finally, let's look at one of the absolutely hardest words to translate in the entire ancient text, hesed. It's a word that shifts dramatically depending on the exact cultural situation it's placed in. When Boaz first meets Ruth, he praises her for her hesed towards her mother-in-law, Naomi. In a lot of Bible versions, this is translated simply as kindness or graciousness. She was a poor widow showing kindness by working hard to feed her mother-in-law. In that context, kindness puts us perfectly in the ballpark.
But things really escalate in chapter 3. Ruth sneaks down to the threshing floor at night, lies down near Boaz, and boldly asks him to be her protector and redeemer. Boaz is obviously startled, but he replies that this second act of Hesed is even greater than her first one.
Let's compare the two contexts. In chapter 2, she gleans for food. But in chapter 3, as Boaz notes, she could have married someone younger or richer outside the family. Instead, she chose to stay within the clan structure to fulfill that incredibly complex Levirate and Goel duty, preserving her dead husband's name and property line. In this specific high-stakes context, translating Hesed as just kindness feels way too weak. Loyalty or faithfulness to the family line is a far more accurate translation, proving once again that context strictly dictates meaning. By simply understanding the ancient laws of inheritance, marriage, and family duty, a confusing story suddenly transforms into a masterclass in legal maneuvering and fierce loyalty. It really makes you wonder, if a single word changes the entire motivation of a historical narrative, how much of the past are we completely missing when we ignore its cultural lens? What other ancient mysteries are hiding in plain sight, just waiting for the right cultural key to unlock them? Keep that in mind the absolute next time you read an ancient text.